In the second half of our class, we're going to talk about the actual history of film's depictions of women. And what we're going to see is a deep contradiction that runs through film portrayals of women. As critics of the movie industry often point out, there's no doubt that films have perpetuated the myth that women are the weaker sex, fated to sacrifice and service men. Women, films tell us again and again, are not real women until they marry and until they bear children. And if you look at films, you'll see that theme worked out again and again. So Betty Davis is the aggressive reporter and sometimes bitch who surrenders her independence on the altar. Or Katharine Hepburn also plays an aggressive newswoman in Woman of the Year and criminally neglects her adopted child. But films also offer images of female strength, female independence, and female assertiveness. But even then, these images tend to be projections of male values and male fantasies as heroines incapable of rational decisions or intense feelings, victims at the mercy of a system that punishes such films. So what we have are contradictions within contradictions in the portrayal of women, that the images of women are often the images of men about women. In 1906, Variety reported, it developed at the inquest on the body of the woman who committed suicide on the stage of the Crystal Theater Monday that she was moved to the act by a motion picture subject, which showed the suicide of a criminal at its climax. Now, this sounds, of course, familiar. We're often told by politicians that film, whatever occurs on the screen is imitated in real life. The woman had been in a bad mental state for some time and was taken to the theater in the hope that the entertainment would cheer her up. Instead, the showing of the picture brought on acute suicidal mania, and she stepped to the stage and shot herself. Movies have always had a tremendous appeal upon us, and from the very beginning, maverick producers gambling on the new medium discovered that sex sold, though it also produced moral outrage. This pattern was established with the very first screen kiss enacted in 1896. Quote, the scene lasted but a few seconds, but met with a violent reaction. Magnified to gargantuan proportions, it is absolutely disgusting. Such things call for police intervention. Production companies like Vitagraph, Biograph, Edison, and Pathé bitterly competed for Nickelodeon crowds. They quickly found that the more risque a movie's title, the more people would come to see it. So we had In the Days of Witchcraft, In Her Boudoir, An Old Man's Darling. Now, of course, those titles were much more risque than the content of the films themselves. So what we're going to do for the second half of our class is look at how movies have portrayed women, from the child women and fragile virgins of the teens, like Mary Pickford and Lillian Gish, to the flappers and symbols of sexual freedom in the 1920s, like Clara Bow, to the models of female strength and independence of the 1930s, 1940s, like Betty Davis, Katharine Hepburn, and Barbara Stanwyck. And then we'll take the story back up to our time. Now, many women have been active in developing the art of movies. There were a number of female screenwriters like Dorothy Parker. There were a number of female directors like Dorothy Arzner. And there were many film critics like Pauline Kael. But of course, the major role for women in film has been as actresses. But the point that I'm going to be making for the second half of our class is that the story of women in film has largely been a story of how men have depicted women. And that image has varied widely from idolatry to rape, from celebration to degradation. One sees successful career women, but more often one sees chorus cuties and femme fatales and hard-boiled gun moms, long-legged pinups, husband-chasing adulteresses, gidgets, and prostitutes. Again, the treatment of women in film is largely the depiction of male fantasies. As we will see, the portrayal of women on the screen has largely taken the form of a number of traditional formulas. And what's striking to me is that these formulas date from the very birth of film. They weren't relatively late inventions, they were relatively early inventions. As early as 1934, a film critic by the name of Erwin Panofsky compiled a list of the stereotypes filmmakers used in depicting women on the screen. He listed the vamp, we'll talk about the vamp in a few moments, the straight girl, the virgin, the maternal type, the tramp, the goddess, the femme fatale, and the masculine feminine woman. What's striking about that list is that that is a relatively inclusive list that you could use to describe female roles even today in the 21st century. Now, the birth of movies, you'll recall, took place during the 1890s. And the birth of film coincided with the emergence of what we called in our class the New Woman. The New Woman was characterized by boldness, by radiant vigor. Women took to the road in tremendous numbers on bicycles. They clutched tennis rackets. They were seen on golf courses or at racetracks smoking cigarettes. Clearly, the Victorian ideal of womanhood was beginning to break down and be replaced by a new vision of woman. The New Woman, you'll recall, was also bold in her demand for political rights. The early woman suffrage movement had been very unpopular. As late as 1900, 4 states gave women the right to vote. But in the 1890s, the women's rights movement began to blossom. It became a great national force as millions of middle-class women agitated for expanded rights. But let's take a look at America's first star. If we could have the overhead projector. This was America's first star. Her name was, do you know who she is? Press your button.
I think she was in Birth of a Nation.
No, this isn't Lillian Gish. This is Mary Pickford. What was her nickname? America's Sweetheart. 1 second. We seem to have a problem. We were talking about the bold, vigorous, new woman, and the most popular actress of the age is Mary Pickford, Could you explain this contradiction to me? Why is she the most popular actress of the time? Yes.
I guess part of it might be because the new woman was maybe a little threatening to the men at the time, and they wanted someone who wasn't so bold. And
I think you're exactly right. For a generation very uncomfortable in the changes that were taking place in women's lives, the idea of the eternal little girl was enormously attractive. And Mary Pickford, more than any other star of the age, embodied that. She had thick golden curls. She had an angel-like face. She was the incarnation of sweetness and childlike innocence. And she always played the same character in her films. She was the winsome waif. She was the sweet little ragamuffin. She always played children. She starred in Child's Tale after Child's Tale. Her movies included Little Red Riding Hood, A Little Princess, and Lena and the Geese. And by 1917, her salary was probably the highest salary in the United States, $350,000 annually plus bonuses. But what's striking is that in real life she got older, but on the screen she got younger. Every role always seemed to be of a younger child, even though she was aging. When she was 24, she played Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. At 26, she played the orphan child in Daddy Longlegs. At 27, she played 12-year-old Pollyanna. At 28, she donned velvet knickers and played Little Lord Fauntleroy. At 32, she played 12-year-old Little Annie Rooney. So she may have gotten older, but for her audiences, she always remained the same. And it was an utterly shocking moment when she eventually cut off her curls. Now, childhood was a preoccupation for Mary Pickford off the screen as well as on the screen. And it reflected her own deprived youth when she had to work to support her younger brother and her younger sister. Her appeal was largely directed at working-class audiences. She was vivacious, she was virginal, and she was young. She was the woman you wanted to mother and protect, and that's what the audiences responded to. So at a time when the roles and status of women were radically changing, at a time when women were throwing away their corsets and lifting their hemlines an inch or two above the floor, at a time when women were dancing the tango, large numbers of working-class Americans clung to Mary Pickford because she represented an older morality. She represented a symbol of tradition. They wanted to mother her. They could sympathize with her poverty. They wanted to possess her youth and her innocence. Okay. Now, if Mary Pickford was the child of Victorian fantasy, then D.W. Griffith, the director, was the model of the man who idealized her. You'll recall that by 1912, D.W. Griffith had already turned out about 400 one- and two-reel films. And even in these earliest films, his penchant was for young, virginal beauties. He gathered a stable of girl children as his leading ladies. This would get Woody Allen in trouble, but it apparently was not a problem at the time. His stable of actresses included Blanche Sweet, who was 17, Mary Pickford, 19, Lillian and Dorothy Gish, 16 and 14, Mae Marsh, 17. They looked young because they were young. On screen, Griffith extolled delicate, virginal maidens. They were invariably slim, blonde, and naive looking. And his films dealt with themes very much provoked by these girl women. His movies dealt obsessively with virtue, with chastity, and with threatened youth. Now, D.W. Griffith's penchant for propriety was almost fetishistic. He believed the kisses were unhygienic, so he devoted much of his film technique to faking kisses on the screen. He was a conscientious moralist who took as his subjects the threat of rape, the dangers of syphilis, and the importance of protecting a woman's honor. So Griffith and his Victorianism viewed women as sexless children. He exalted heroines with slim, almost boyish frames and sweet, plump faces. So his ideal is clearly the pre-adolescent girl. And the woman is turned into girl in his films. Now, let's take a look at our overhead projector and look at another picture. This does not look like Mary Pickford. Who is this? What's this woman's name? Do you know? Her name is Theda Bara. And what character does she play? She's the, push your button, please.
She's the vamp.
She's the vamp. What is a vamp? What's a vamp?
I guess it was really short for vampirus.
It's a female vampire.
Preys on
but
men.
what's it mean?
She preys on men.
She's not Dracula. She
Well,
doesn't
no.
suck blood, literally. What does she do? What
She
does a
entices
vamp
them and
do? Destroys them.
destroys them.
Okay. In film history, whenever you get one female stereotype, you will always get its mere opposite. And that's part of that phenomena I talked about earlier called cultural inversion. So if you get the child woman, the vamp to me is the exact opposite. The vamp is exotic. The vamp is a symbol of malignant sexuality. She is the symbol of the woman who drains the lifeblood out of men by sucking out their sexuality. Now, one suspects that the vamp had very different meanings to women in the audience, and Theda Bara herself said that she viewed the vamp as revenge for all the injustices that men had inflicted upon women. But there's no question, I think, to men, she became the symbol of forbidden sexuality. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation appeared in 1915, and that same year marked the screen debut of The Vamp, when Theda Bara played A Fool There Was. She told her man, kiss me, you fool," and he did. And it seemed to be a very different image than Lillian Gish in Birth of a Nation, protecting her honor. Now, even before Theda Bara appeared on the screen, there was a massive publicity campaign. She was billed as an exotic daughter of Egypt. She was actually Jewish and from Cincinnati, but who could tell with her makeup, her long hair, and her exotic garb. She alluded to a mysterious past. Her hair went down to her waist. She wore crude makeup. She embodied still primitive notions of depravity and wanton lust. So why, if people would go to see Mary Pickford, would they go to see the vamp? If everything I said before about the America's sweetheart, the child woman, was true, what's the appeal of the vamp? What do you think?
One movie you took your wife to and the other you didn't?
But this is still a kind of Victorian society. What's the appeal? What do you think?
She's what they were afraid of?
I think that's part of it. And she's such an extreme image of sexuality that's actually easier to handle than a more realistic image, right? Remember we talked about the psychological process of splitting. And often, young children split things into sharp extremes. And it seems in the early era of film, this splitting of characters into sharp extremes. You have the totally asexual child woman and the totally depraved vamp. And these exist side by side. Between 1915 and 1918, Theda Bara made 40 films that all capitalized on her predatory image. There was the serpent, the vixen, the she-devil. No one would confuse Theda Bara with the girl next door. Now, Theda Bara's popularity came to a swift end, but she would inspire a host of imitators, most notably Pola Negri, who I believe is still alive and living in San Antonio today, and Nita Naldi. These were actresses who drove men to adultery and ruin while reading lines like, quote, "Someday you will beat me with these strong hands. I'd like to know what it feels like." Again, what should we make of this and the appeal of this? For a society that's beginning to shed its Victorian inhibitions, I think it was, again, easier to handle these extreme images, which could also, of course, be treated as if they're lessons to be learned, that these are sort of moralizing movies, than it would have been to deal with real women who had sexual feelings. Okay, films not only follow social trends, but once in a while, they also shape social trends. One of the most influential post-World War I films was called Flaming Youth, and it created a revolution in feminine fashion. The star of the film's name was Colleen Moore, and she chopped off her curls. She openly flirted on the screen, and she wore a natural and skimpy dress. She became the symbol of the flapper, and millions of younger women began to look just like her. But the flapper was essentially a revolution in style. It was a surface revolution. It was not fundamentally a revolution in female behavior. The myth of the 1920s is that young women were petting and partying in total sexual abandon. But if you go to the movies, you will see that the movies of the 1920s have a very prudish heart. The theme that runs through most of the films of the 1920s is the Cinderella story, just updated into the modern world. These films often straddle the moral fence, but in the end, they always come down on the side of time-honored values. So take, for example, King Vidor's Wine of Youth. A liberated flapper can't decide which of two men she should marry. There's a wild party, there's a co-ed camping trip, but our liberated woman resists compromising her virtue, and she ends up snuggling next to her man on the family sofa. So however radical the films might be on the surface, they always opt out for tradition in the end. The moral message of 1920s films were embarrassingly simplistic. In 1929's film, which asks the question, why be good? A poor maiden succeeds in marrying a wealthy boy because she was not corrupted by going to a roadside bar. Why be good? Because it will work to your advantage in the long run, and you'll snag a rich husband. The screen abounded in the 1920s with working girls, and every prominent actress became a stenographic, dishwashing, or hat-checking Cinderella. If she kept her virtue, in the end, she would triumph and rise up out of the working class. Now, during Hollywood's first years, women found surprising opportunities in Hollywood as screenwriters, production assistants, even as directors. As late as 1928, women made up 20% of screenplay writers. But by 1935, this had fallen to 15%, and by 1940 to 10%. So at first, at least, film was an area, one of the few areas where women had a surprising degree of opportunity in American society. But let's now turn to the depiction of women in the 1930s. The Great Depression of the 1930s had a powerful impact on families and gender roles. It forced couples to delay marriage. It lowered the divorce rate for the simple reason that people couldn't afford divorces. And it drove the birth rate down below the replacement level for the first time in American history. But the Depression also altered roles within the family. Many unemployed fathers saw their status lowered. Men who had no wages to punctuate their authority lost power as primary decision makers. Large numbers of men who could not fulfill their role as breadwinner lost self-respect. They became immobilized. They stopped looking for work. Other men turned to alcohol or became self-destructive or began to abuse their families. Still, other men walked out the door, never to return again. A survey in 1940 found that more than 1 million American women had been deserted by their husbands. So, you would think that the screen image of women in the 1930s might show women to be beleaguered. You might think that the screen image of women in the 1930s might focus on women in families, and you would be absolutely wrong. In contrast to men, many women saw their status rise during the Great Depression. Despite the historic opposition to outside employment for married women, wives began to enter the workplace in larger numbers. Most worked as secretaries or salespersons or textile workers, but regardless of their jobs, the fact that they worked elevated women's position within the family. Bringing home a paycheck gave a woman economic power, and economic power gave her emotional power. It strengthened her voice inside the family. Now, the treatment of gender in Depression-era films lays bare many of the tensions in a society that's trying to preserve traditional values at a time of momentous social upheaval. So films have to deal with a lot of contradictions. They're trying to maintain traditional moral values at a time when everything in society is being upset. So in describing images of women in film, it's crucial to distinguish between movies made before 1934 and those movies made after 1934. Remember, in 1934, the production code, which governed what could be presented on the screen, was tightened and rigidly enforced. It set rigid standards for proper moral conduct on the screen. Passionate embraces were discouraged. Exposure of sex organs was forbidden, including the animals like the chimp in Tarzan. Revealing clothing for women was barred. Before the enforcement of the production code in 1934, Hollywood had experienced one of its most creative periods in all film history. For a few brief years, women were conceived of having sexual desires without being freaks, villains, or even necessarily being European. Women initiated sexual encounters, pursued men, even pursued careers without being stigmatized as unfeminine. In Morocco, Marlene Dietrich stands in front of a firing squad. And what does she do? She applies lipstick while the men aim their rifles. In Design for Living, actress Miriam Hopkins is in love with two men, one a playwright, the other a painter. She marries one, but spends the night with the other while her husband is away. In the end, instead of choosing between the two men, she decides to live with them both. Another example of the openness and experimentation of the pre-code period is Greta Garbo's Queen Christiana. Garbo plays a 17th century Swedish queen who rides around in men's clothing to escape the confines of court life. But the star that everyone remembers from the pre-1934 period is, of course, Mae West. In 1935, she earned $480,000, the second most in the country, topped only by newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. But the production code would deal a body blow to Mae West's unique brand of bawdiness and suggestiveness. But it would benefit many other actresses. During the 1930s, there was a political backlash against working women. There were many efforts by government to force women who had husbands in the labor force to get out of the workforce. There was much agitation that women should not work at all because they only worked for what was called pin money, not to support their families. But remember that phenomena I called cultural inversion? Whenever one image is dominant in society, you often get the mirror image on the screen. Well, what happens in the 1930s is you get images unparalleled in Hollywood history of independent, strong-minded, self-assertive women. the greatest roles ever for actresses occurred during the 1930s, at just the moment you might expect the worst images of womanhood. The 1930s offered actresses unprecedented opportunities to play strong, independent women. But there were many other images of women as well, as gauchely ignorant shopgirls, as backbiting hellcats, and cold-hearted career women. But the actresses who got their start in the 1930s would dominate film throughout its golden age. Barbara Stanwyck, Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, the women who would get their starts in the 30s would become the dominant actresses in film history, precisely because they played these strong roles. Now, the women's films of the 1930s are very multi-layered. They offer both traditional images of womanhood, and they also offer images of women breaking free of traditional roles and breaking free of societal restraints. And so a lot of the appeal of these films, I think, is that they're dual-edged. So, for example, remember I mentioned the film Imitation of Life, 1934. Claudette Colbert opens a restaurant. She becomes very financially successful, and a woman who views that could identify with that. But it also emphasizes her tortured relationship with her daughter, and a woman who's viewing the film could identify with that. So these films often are what I would call multi-layered. They have different images that people can identify with. The early 30s saw a release of a number of scandalous films portraying unmarried sex, extramarital flirting, and dialogue dripping with sexual innuendo, which offered a frank depiction of conventional morals under attack. In Red-Headed Woman, 1932, Jean Harlow breaks up her boss's marriage and then moves on to his older, wealthier business associate. She takes a French chauffeur as her lover and ends up seducing a third rich man. It's hard to imagine Hollywood making a film like that even now. In Ex-Lady, Bette Davis is a commercial artist who lives with her boyfriend but refuses to marry him. Her boyfriend calls her father hopelessly old-fashioned. We're in love with each other, and we don't want to get married. Davis shrugs off the idea of motherhood, saying, "When I'm 40, I'll think about babies." In Employee's Restaurant, 1933, Loretta Young sleeps with a department store manager to get her job. In Female, 1933, Ruth Chatterton plays the sexually predatory executive who sleeps with the handsome young men who work for her car manufacturing company. No one said these films were realistic. In Babyface, also 1933, Barbara Stanwyck sleeps her way up from a speakeasy to a lavish love nest. But enforcement of the production code ended films like that. And there's no question. The production code took out much of the liveliness, the sexiness, and the realism from the movies and replaced it with a coyness and a romantic haze that would persist until the 1960s. Jean Harlow tries on a dress in a store and asks the saleswoman, "Can you see through this?" "I'm afraid you can," the clerk answers. She snaps back, "I'll take it." You don't get dialogue like that after 1934. During the 1930s, women receive many ambiguous and conflicting messages from the screen. In general, I think it's fair to say that movies of the 30s reflect traditional attitudes about women's roles. Women were told repeatedly that their only acceptable role lay in marriage or family or deference to men. But the most important, the most influential, and in many ways the most popular films of the 1930s present a cast of independent and powerful women, much more than in the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s. Compared to their counterparts in the 60s or 70s, the roles available to women in the 30s made it a wonderfully, really incredibly liberated period for women in film. The code de-emphasized sex. The code de-emphasized passion. It forced women out of the bedroom. It forced women into the working world. The movie industry now gave women careers typified by the large numbers of reporters that dot the films of the 1930s. Another role available to actresses was that of the gold digger. The gold digger was a young woman on the make for a husband. Often they were chorus girls or they were models. Ginger Rogers, Ruby Keeler, Joan Blondell all made their names as gold diggers. The snappy tone of the gold digger movies was echoed by the screwball comedies of the 30s. Most of the screwball comedies resembled The Awful Truth in featuring the battle of the sexes as a battle among equals. The heroines of these screwball comedies, like Carole Lombard, emerge as wonderful, if somewhat wacky characters with brains of their own. Let's take a look at our overhead projector and take a look at some of the most influential actresses of the 1930s. This is Barbara Stanwyck. You probably remember her from the Western The Big Valley, but she was probably the most influential actress, I think, in more important roles in the 30s and 40s than anyone else. Deanna Durbin, Dorothy Lamour, Joan Crawford, another picture of Joan Crawford. Moving ahead to the 1940s, this is Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth again. And again. Betty Grable. Katharine Hepburn, of course, still alive today. Lauren Bacall. Moving a little further ahead, Jennifer Jones. Betty Davis. Betty Davis again. Judy Garland. Okay, we can stop with that image. Katharine Hepburn's career began in 1932 with roles including aristocratic upper-class screwball heroines, career women, and small-town social climbers. Betty Davis played a succession of unsavory roles, as in Dangerous in 1935, in which he plays a wife who deliberately causes an auto accident when her husband refuses to give her a divorce. We're going to see a clip from Bette Davis. This is from much later. It's from All About Eve, which is one of the really greatest films that Hollywood ever produced. It's from 1950, and it deals with the plight of the older woman, a theme that was also dealt with in Sunset Boulevard. The story of All About Eve is about an aspiring young actress, Eve, who intrigues to take the place of the aging Margot Channing, played by Bette Davis. She wants to take her place both on stage and in bed, and the battle is fought with tooth, claw, and some of the greatest epigrams that Hollywood screenwriters ever produced. It's of the "You're sneaky and corrupt, but so am I. We belong to each other," darling school of movie making. It's just a remarkable work. It may be schlock, but it's schlock of the highest kind. If we could just see this very brief clip, you'll get a sense of Bette Davis.
Don't get stuck on some glamour puss.
I'll try.
You're not much of a bargain, you know. You're conceited and thoughtless and messy.
Well, everybody can't be Gregory Peck.
You're a setup for some gorgeous, wide-eyed young babe.
How childish are you going to get before you stop it?
I don't want to be childish. I'd settle for a few years.
And cut that out right now.
Okay, let's stop there. You get a sense of Bette Davis as tough-talking, acid wit, someone who's very strong and very different than later actresses that Hollywood would portray. But even in the 1930s, the top box office attraction were child women, once again. They were children like Judy Garland and, of course, Shirley Temple, who was the #1 box office star in 1935 and again in 1938. Just incredible. In many of her films, Shirley Temple plays an orphan. She has no parents to rule her life, so she's free to join the British troops in India. She's free to board ocean liners to the Far East. She's free to win radio contests and talent searches. And by 1940, she had already starred in 21 films. I should emphasize that even in the 1930s, the heroines were not uniformly independent, intelligent, and autonomous women. The conventional ending of most films was of a woman renouncing her independence for the fulfillment of marriage and family life. So for 89 minutes, a woman pursues her own career, she runs her own business, and then she's married off at the end. Indeed, many film images of women from the 1930s are unflattering and degrading. In Public Enemy, Jimmy Cagney shoves a grapefruit into Mae Clark's face. In Busby Berkeley's fantasy extravaganzas, women are portrayed as harps, typewriters, mechanical dolls wound up by males, flowers, and water nymphs. Sexual undercurrents are unmistakable in the musical Footlight Parade, where a camera parades across women's thighs, spread open to reveal bead-covered crotches. Many of the films that gave women leading roles cast them in a negative light. Claire Booth Luce, she was married to the founder of Time magazine and Life magazine, wrote the all-woman 1939 film The Women, starring Norma Shearer, Joan Fontaine, Joan Crawford, Rosalind Russell, and Donna Reed, and it portrayed women as schemers, and shallow, conniving gossips and marriage wreckers. And yet the 1930s did something that doesn't really happen very often after the 1930s. It places women's experience in the foreground. But this film, The Women, also expressed women's anger. When one woman complains that men want nothing of women but their bodies, another replies, "What else have we got to offer?" One role that did open up for women in the 1930s was that of Hollywood gossip columnists. Two women dominated Hollywood gossip in the 1930s, Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper. Parsons was a columnist for the Hearst chain of newspapers, which was then at its height. Her column appeared in more than 400 papers. Like Parsons, Hedda Hopper fed the nation's voracious appetite for gossip and rumors about Hollywood stars. So let's now move on to the 1940s. The 1940s has often been dubbed the era of the woman's picture. For the first time, Hollywood concentrated heavily on films depicting women's lives, women's problems, probing women's emotions, and displaying them against a wide range of occupations. Why was that? Why were women so important in films in the 1940s?
Because a lot of women were going to work to help with the war effort, and so things were changing again.
Okay, so women are in the workplace, but what else?
During the war, women were the main audience left back in the States. Most of the men were already overseas.
Absolutely. For the first time since the 1920s, the audience was overwhelmingly female. Now, a few films would show women engaged in war work. Ann Sothern would be an aircraft worker in Swing Shift Maisie. Lucille Ball would be a defense worker in Meet the People. Jennifer Jones gives up the idea of going to college and becomes a nurse's aide in Since You Went Away. But the most moving and affecting films were simpler. They showed the ways that women came to grips with a man-free existence. In Something for the Boys, Carmen Miranda and Vivian Blaine convert a decrepit mansion into a home for war wives. In The Doughgirls, Ann Sheridan plays one of a group of unmarried women who pretend to marry in order to keep their Washington hotel rooms. A flood of war widow movies pour out of Hollywood, such as Bette Davis losing her husband in the underground resistance in Watch on the Rhine. And for the first time, Hollywood shows women entering professions requiring brains and fortitude. Claudette Colbert, Bette Davis, Joan Crawford play novelists. Loretta Young, Jean Arthur become congresswomen. Ingrid Bergman becomes a psychiatrist. So in other words, once again, we see how the circumstances of a particular time period result in sharp changes and revisions in the treatment of women. During the war, 7 million women who had never worked before went to work in factories, in offices, in the professions, in the services, and on farms. More of a third of the new female recruits were former housewives. 1.5 million were the mothers of children under the age of 10. Yet despite this influx of women into the workforce, most World War II women's films dealt with women as housewives. During the Second World War, Hollywood and the rest of American society was obsessed with mothering. Every imaginable problem could be blamed on faulty mothering. Truancy from school, sleeping and eating disorders, running away from home, all could be blamed on maternal neglect. Thumb-sucking, bedwetting, whining, any kind of infantile behavior was evidence of the deprivation or perversion of maternal care. But commentators weren't just interested in women who didn't sufficiently mother their children. They were also concerned with just the opposite. They were concerned with what they called maternal over-solicitousness or momism. That is, women who doted and sacrificed excessively for their children. The psychiatric consultant to the U.S. Surgeon General made front-page headlines when he said that the 350,000 men who evaded military service had done so because they had been ruined by their mother's overindulgence. The best-selling book of 1942 had the title, A Generation of Vipers, and you can only guess who those vipers were. Overly protective mothers produced psychiatric disorders in their children. That was the message of A Generation of Vipers. So, one of the most popular themes of wartime movies was the mother as emotional monster. The mother who is the monster to blame for everything that goes wrong with her children. And it was the film Mildred Pierce, in which Joan Crawford devotes herself so totally to her spoiled older daughter that she alienates her husband. For the sole purpose of dressing her daughter in the best clothes, Crawford marries a cad and attempts to take a murder rap when her daughter kills him. So clearly, the image of motherhood, as we talked about earlier in our class, is undergoing dramatic changes during the war years. The other female role that was of crucial importance during the war years is the role of the femme fatale, or the evil woman. The femme fatale, or the evil woman. If you've ever seen The Maltese Falcon, or especially The Postman Always Rings Twice, or Double Indemnity, you know about the evil woman. This is a woman without conscience, a woman without human emotions, a woman lusting for power, for love, for money. She's often played by Barbara Stanwyck. And these are among the most powerful female roles on the screen. And it's something that we'll talk about in a later class when we talk about a new film genre called film noir, N-O-I-R, film noir. Nowhere did icy, premeditated female greed and evil stand out more thoroughly than in the 1944 classic Double Indemnity. Barbara Stanwyck seduces insurance agent Fred McMurray into carrying out the murder of her husband. In 1945, Jean Tierney in Leave Her to Heaven is madly possessive of her husband and unblinkingly drowns his crippled brother and induces a miscarriage. The intermingling of female evil and sensuality dominated the screen during the war. Why? Why do you think this image of the evil woman would be so popular during the war years at a time when women made up the majority of the audience? What do you think? Any thoughts? I mean, clearly part of it, once again, is our theme of cultural inversion. And this is the independent woman taken to her extreme, right? It's a sort of cautionary tale of what women could be capable of if stripped from traditional morality. But if you have any other thoughts, I'd be very curious in hearing what they might be. I mean, these are the most powerful images imaginable. And if you've ever seen Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity, it's images that you will never forget. I mean, they have a kind of primal power to them that only movies can achieve. Now, the polar opposite of the evil woman is the female victim. The woman afflicted with meningitis. The woman trailed by a maniac. The terrorized wife slowly being poisoned. The woman slowly being induced to a nervous breakdown. So if you had one image of womanhood, which is of conscienceless, premeditated evil, the other image is woman as total victim of forces that she can't control. Take Johnny Belinda, 1948. Jane Wyman is persecuted by a brute who rapes her, kills her father, then tries to kidnap their illegitimate child that she had conceived by him. Or take Gaslight. Charles Boyer marries Ingrid Bergman so he can have the opportunity to search for her dead aunt's hidden jewels. He flickers lights when she's in the room and insists that she's an invalid. He nearly succeeds in committing her to a sanitarium. So why do you think these images of women were so popular? Woman as victim. Please.
Well, victims always evoke pity and feeling sorry for them, and it you know, you look at the screen and there's someone who has it worse off than I do.
I mean, it's very interesting that at the time that Hollywood was foregrounding the female audience, that the evil woman and the evil victim became two ways, two forms for linking to that audience. I don't offer explanation to this, but it is, I think, a striking phenomenon. A prominent psychiatrist in 1947 declared, women are restless and dissatisfied because they cannot or will not accept their physical destiny. During the Second World War, older and married women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Women accounted for 25% of workers in 1940 and 36% in 1945. For the first time, older married women comprised a majority of the female workforce. And, not surprisingly, the post-war era saw a sharp reaction against the idea of the woman worker. There was a kind of concerted cultural effort to get women back in the home. And women responded, and during the post-war period, women married younger than at any previous time during the 20th century. During the 1950s, more women married at the age of 17 than any other age. Most women, by the end of the 1950s, were married before their 21st birthday. Magazines celebrated domestic bliss. Sociologists warned women about the dangers of spinsterhood. The Saturday Evening Post editorialized, "The lost generation didn't get lost. It settled down and raised families." Movies would reflect this world. No more independent, career-minded heroines. Instead, we had this: women trying to catch their man. That was the theme of Three Coins in a Fountain, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire, Annie, Get Your Gun. Women preparing for a wedding, Father of the Bride, High Society, The Catered Affair, or Contented Wives. That was the theme of Written on the Wind, The Tarnished Angels, The Country Girl, No Down Payment, The Big Carnival. A folksy family atmosphere pervaded much of Hollywood's 50s output. Take a look at Little Women, or Cheaper by the Dozen, or Life with Father, or I Remember Mama. All of these were in various ways celebrations of family life. The ideal Hollywood wife in the 1950s waits endlessly for her husband to return home. She's often played by June Allison. I have a picture of her if I can find this very quickly, which I'm not sure I'll be able to do. If we could have the overhead projector, there's June Allison. She sobs, she suffers for her man rather than for herself in such films as The Stratton Story, The Glenn Miller Story, Executive Suite, Woman's World, Strategic Air Command, The McConnell Story. Many 50s films were totally devoid of women, or they exiled women to the most minor of roles. Think of The Caine Mutiny, or The Wild One, or 12 Angry Men, or Mr. Roberts, or Bridge on the River Kwai. We're going to talk about something that I'm going to call the symbolic annihilation of women. If you grew up like I did in the 1950s, and you spent a lot of time in front of the TV set or at the movie theater, you lived in a world where women's existence was in many ways denied. It was a world very different than the real world, but one that you were exposed to over and over again. Women's films of the 50s divorced themselves from the controversial and became how-tos on catching and keeping a man. In Les Girls, 1957, Mitzi Gaynor accepts Gene Kelly's proposal of marriage, then invites him up to her apartment for a test. With her hair in curlers, face in cold cream, and feet in a pot of hot water, does he still want her? In Comeback Little Sheba, Shirley Booth is a frumpy wife whose sloppiness sends her youthful, muscular husband, Burt Lancaster, to another woman. A message repeated again and again during the 50s was that only a husband and children could keep a woman warm when the wrinkles start setting in. Betty Davis in The Star is on the skids. She's an Academy Award winner whose humiliations include a drunken arrest, an embarrassing screen test for for a supporting role where she prances around like a sexy Scarlet, and a hysterical collapse before she learns that she has neglected the importance of being a woman first. In Sunset Boulevard, Gloria Swanson is a fading movie star who is despairingly lonely because she's failed to focus on real things, on a man and her children. A favorite subject of the 1950s, often taken from works by the great playwright Tennessee Williams, is the woman alone. Neurotic, frantic, talky, eccentric, flirting with madness. The roster of pathetic women alone is impressive. It includes The Glass Menagerie, Suddenly Last Summer, Summer and Smoke, Sweet Bird of Youth. The premise in these movies and many others, like The African Queen, is that without a man, a woman is only half a person. A few movies did deal obliquely with female discontent. Hollywood captured women's dissatisfaction in two of its soapiest and most popular efforts, Peyton Place and The Best of Everything. In Peyton Place, Lana Turner's the mother of an illegitimate daughter. Hope Lange is raped by her stepfather. Terry Moore is the town tramp. Boredom cultivates lust and petty gossip. The Best of Everything tells the story of the whores greeting eager beaver career girls in a big city publishing firm. What's the best of everything? It's in fact the worst of everything. Diane Baker becomes pregnant. Aspiring actress Susie Parker gives herself to a Broadway stage director, and one day spying on him falls to her death from a fire escape. The message is that careers are not the path to happiness. But, of course, the image that we all remember from the 1950s is not the images that we've been talking about so far. The image that we think of, if we could have the overhead projector, is, of course, of Marilyn Monroe and other empty-headed, big-breasted blondes. The 1950s was the decade of mammary madness, when big-breasted women were elevated to goddesses. Here's Ava Gardner. She was an ornament. Unlike a housewife, she performed no daily tasks. She luxuriated in her own uselessness. Her clothes were form-fitting and uncomfortable, but who noticed that they weren't very practical? Biblical sagas allowed for plenty of beautiful women to be wrapped in form-fitting togas. Jean Simmons in The Robe, Hedy Lamarr in Samson and Delilah, Susan Hayward in Demetrius and the Gladiators, Gina Lollobrigida in Solomon and Sheba. But the key figure was Marilyn Monroe. Almost entirely, she played the delicious, dumb blonde with both heart and head as soft as a cotton ball. So explain to me, if you might, why, if John Wayne is our favorite movie hero, that Marilyn Monroe, years, now decades after her death, remains our most popular actress. How would you explain this?
She died young and left a good-looking corpse.
I guess that's a possibility. Young death always works in Hollywood, just ask James Dean. But what's the attraction especially now, after feminism, what could be the appeal of the figure that she represents? Yes?
Well, I've never seen any of her movies, but I think part of it is because she makes men feel so great. You know, it's never putting them down, it's always lifting them up, and men love that.
Though I should add that Gloria Steinem has written a biography of Marilyn Monroe. Her appeal, I think, does transcend gender lines. It's a very interesting thing. She paved the way for a surge of imitators: Sherry North, Mamie Van Doren, Diana Dors, Monique Van Voren, Anita Ekberg, and Jane Mansfield. And these actresses almost always played the same role. They played mistresses in films. There was another very popular role for women in the 1950s, and that's the role of daddy's little girl. The precocious teen, like Debbie Reynolds, Natalie Wood, Tuesday Weld, Leslie Caron, and the most popular of all, Audrey Hepburn. So once again, you get the girl woman as the most popular figure, that despite all the attraction of the actresses, it's these younger women that seem to have a tremendous appeal in the 1950s. Let's end our class right there.